Kia ora, my name's Annabelle Pretty. I'm from Unisec Te Pukenga, and this is a presentation about the black box of Zoom, a transformative facilitation of Master of Architecture professional students during the lockdown of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So when we think of Master of Architecture professional education, it's relatively consistent across the board of Aotearoa and New Zealand. And we have a 5-year program, a 3-year undergraduate and a 2-year master's program. And the 2-year master program, the first year is largely taught, and the second year is a capstone or a full year thesis project, which is a combination of both written and design. When we think of Rainer Banham and his writing in the 1990s, he wrote an article called a black box, the secret profession of architecture. And he suggests that architecture is not what is done, but how it's done, and distinguishes 6 attributes of a black box of architecture. First 2 being functional environmental performance, and the second and third being beauty of form and deftness of space, and the 4th and 5th being truth to materials and structural efficiency. And this is kind of the lens that I'm looking at this paper. So the team of 5 million is a quote which our Prime Minister used for the pandemic, and it was very much one of the defining quotes throughout the era. So Banham thinks about functional or environmental performance, and we might think about that in terms of how the typical capstone or thesis projects is comprised of, which is the document and an in-person fiver or presentation of all the design work. When we think of presentation of a thesis project, we think of 3 things, which is the 3-dimensional, which is the feast for the fingers. Typically architects like touching things. The 2-dimensional, which is a feast for the eyes, and that's typically 2-dimensional things, computer-generated drawings, layers over drawings. And then we've got the verbal or the auditory or the performance, which is the feast for the ears. And so we like to think of all of these 3 things. So prior to the pandemic, so this is a student who presented in 2019, mid-year, we've got multiple 2-dimensional items and 3-dimensional items, and of course they often have a PowerPoint presentation as well. And this is another student who has got quite a large model, quite a long complex project, and has both 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional. Then when the COVID-19 pandemic came to New Zealand and broke through our borders, we had a number of lockdowns in Tamaki Marakarau, which is the Māori name for Auckland. And we have these full self-isolation lockdowns. So 45 days or so in March 2020, 17 days or so in August 2020, 14 days over into February of 21, and 107 days laterally in that August. So we had 2 August lockdowns, obviously the 2021 one being very long. So although we dodged the COVID-19 bullet in 2020 for examinations, we certainly didn't in general teaching. And we've got this general yo-yoing backwards and forwards between lockdowns to in-person to lockdowns and in-person. And the added complication is the government mandated that we needed to have 14 days close contact isolation. If somebody in your family had COVID, then the whole household was put into lockdown. So this made for complications for students, because sometimes they were available and sometimes they weren't. So this led to even more complications with teaching. So typically during that time, we had in-person presentations, and they were fairly normal, a mixture of 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional work. And so relatively easy for the early days in the pandemic. And these are some of the design awards, which goes across New Zealand. So again, large panels, relatively easy. Banham talked about, obviously, beauty of form and deftness of space. And so we can use that analogy and attributes to think about black box architecture. So 2021 was okay, but early 2021, but when we went 2021 to 22, it's quite a different narrative. So February 21, we were in lockdown. We did have our last in-person examinations, 11 students. And then because we had the massive lockdown, everything from then on has been online, in fact, online until a couple of months ago, partly to give assurance to the students that they know what they're doing, even if they have to move backwards and forwards. So the numbers in brackets are the number of students that are examined. Interestingly, we had a number of students that chose to make the content of their capstone project about pandemics, and this is one such student who was thinking of a future that is full of an architectural world of pandemic. So, of course, once we move to a hybrid or utterly to Zoom in some situations, this is often what we were seeing as we stared into the black screen. And the abyss of these black screens became quite a complicated paradigm. So early on, students predominantly had cameras off, and this was partly because they had prioritized buying laptops that didn't have cameras because they had more processing power. And they also really didn't want to invite people into their private space in big situations, particularly when it was being recorded. Students were quite unhappy about that. When one-on-one with students and their supervisors, it's relatively easy. Usually it was done in person if they had the camera then. But certainly early on, this is what your average supervisor would be looking at, basically a tessellation of names, and that's it essentially. So these are typical examinations, and you'll see that often staff would have their cameras on and students would not have their cameras on. So that kind of is quite interesting. And then if we're thinking of Banham's truth of materials or structural efficiency, we might go back to thinking of reflections of the black box and how to think about it being a pedagogical framework. One of the things that students really realised that supervisors could offer a safe space when they were one-on-one, but it became quite much more complicated when they had numerous students and numerous staff. And so trying to work out that they had confidence and that their participation and curiosity and willingness to share knowledge was really important for them and for other students. So more latterly, students are becoming much more familiar with having their cameras on, and certainly there's a much greater interaction from students, and everyone's much more familiar about it. So teaching and supervising fifth-year architecture students is demonstrably much more straightforward than teaching other year groups. Teaching first-year students is much, much tougher than teaching fifth-year students. Yet there's some interesting conclusions to think about this. So the general conclusions are, one of the things we found is that you've got to be constantly flexible, swapping from online to in-person on a daily basis, and being clear with students which way and which was most important. Fast decision-making from staff was essential to create clarity for students and for planning for students, even when you're switching between the different modes, because it allows for agency for both the supervisees and the students. And ensuring from a supervisor's point of view, clear boundaries about when they're available and when they're not was incredibly important. So conclusions in terms of cons in using the black box of Zoom is that many students through their student evaluations have really felt that the last 18 months they've felt very isolated, and that the architectural studio atmosphere is incredibly evaporated and they feel as empty as a black box. And learning is definitely prevaricated about having a capable device that has consistent Wi-Fi and access to software. Normally, of course, an institute would provide software for students to use. So getting Adobe and Revit and all of those kind of things out to students became quite complex. And the general lack of peer-to-peer learning that we have within a studio situation when they're learning something quite complicated like Lumion or Unreal Engine, we really missed that when we were in lockdown, because there really just wasn't that sort of opportunity. Although some students did arrange to meet and discuss, it still didn't work as well as it did in person. And of course, the lack of student cameras due to them prioritizing graphics cards. And of course, complete absence of 3D models. They became utterly forgotten for 2D imagery. It became impossible for them to laser cut within the time frames. And the issue of personal space and public space and what was personal and public when you are in a recording became really a complicated thing to think about. But there were some pros, and the pros were quite interesting. So we got the students to basically print their banners as they would have done in previous years and send them out to the examiners. So there was certainly a fastness and a cheapness that they didn't have to print, where normally they would be printing large banners for 5-meter presentations. So that was kind of an added bonus for the students. And we also gained a digital archive of student work, which has allowed for easy sharing across all new students which have come into the program, which has been really beneficial. And the 2D nature of online presentations allowed for much more digital animation and sound to be embedded. We talked a lot with students about how to maximize a two-dimensional space or a window, a black box window, and how you maximize that. And thinking about sound in animation became really as important as you would have normally been when using a 3-dimensional work. So it led to much stronger 2-dimensional work. And lastly, the thing about working in this hybrid situation is that everyone became completely and utterly transformed with this hybridity and flexibility, and it's led to some really interesting ways of working. So we're only just now going back to being in-person examinations, and it's been a really interesting time to learn new ways of doing things and very transformational. Thank you very much.